Story 1. When she went on maternity leave, my temporary therapist made more progress with me in a few months than she had in years. I left her and have been seeing the new therapist for 7 years now. Story 2. When I found out my mother only took me to a therapist because the school was making her, and the therapist was also my mother's therapist, and they would discuss my sessions together when I was not present, I felt I had no choice but to continue attending. However, I stopped putting any real effort into those sessions. Story 3. I went to a therapist only once, a very reputable and acclaimed author at that. He takes photographs of all his first-time visitors, and I told him I was not comfortable with that because I was not feeling great about how I look. He said, "That is weird. I have never been to a therapist since." Story 4. My ex was seeing a therapist and suggested I talk to her as a trial before doing couples therapy with her. I supported couples therapy. The therapist, who I later found out was a friend of my ex from the bar and was at best a life coach, relayed my concerns to my ex before we met, probably at the bar. I know because my ex came home drunk and was yelling about what I had said about her. Story 5. My wife and I went to a couples therapist some years ago during a difficult period. The therapist would gossip about other clients. We ended up bonding over how repulsed we were by her behavior. Story 6. I have known this for a while now, and luckily my insurance covers everything. He talks more than I do and often interrupts me during a line of thought. The surprising part is when he spent about half an hour talking about 1970s rock and roll, including why the old Journey band was better than the newer, more popular Journey. He often gives long explanations like this, and I wonder what this has to do with my mental health. Story 7. As a therapist, I am both making sure I am not on here and feeling much better about my ability to not make catastrophic mistakes. Story 8. When I took my 12-year-old daughter, who was having some anxiety issues, the therapist said, "You are always going to feel this way. She is 19 now, worked through it, and is thriving." Story 9. When she focused so much time on the Enneagram, I had never even heard of it. Suddenly, once she knew my type, the therapy was geared around it. She would say, "Oh, you're being such a my number right now." Story 10. I was 9. I told them that I wanted to die, and they said, "Okay, then grab that book off the shelf, the heavy one. Now hit yourself in the head with it as hard as you can." I think he was trying to make a point, like, "See, you don't want to hurt yourself. You won't bludgeon yourself with a book." He got mad that I bled on his carpet. Story 11. I don't have a therapist, but my friend's therapist told him he clearly doesn't have any problems because he has a good job. Sigh. Story 12. They had 5 problems with their Zoom client every session. It looked like they were just lounging on their bed with their phone and had no advice specific to my situation. Story 13. When my ex and I went for couples therapy because our relationship had become so bad that he started physically abusing me. He claimed it was due to his childhood trauma, and the therapist sided with him on nearly everything, refusing to listen to anything I had to say. I stopped going very quickly. Story 14. When I explained to her how badly my ex was abusing me and how I was dealing with not bringing past trauma into my new relationship, she started going off about how I was just opening up a world of new abuse because I didn't wait long enough in between. She said I was the reason why he abused me and that she wouldn't feel bad if my new partner did the same things that my ex did. I walked out of that office and never went back. My new therapist has been absolutely amazing, and I have been with my partner for almost 2 years now with no issues. Story 15. Had to do therapy when I got caught for marijuana. The therapist kept pushing me to take antidepressants. I refused every time. The therapist kept threatening to make it court-ordered. I still never took them. Life was difficult when you got randomly drug tested 3 times a week while in high school. Story 16. We moved to Washington State, and I fell into a deep depression. I honestly think it had a lot to do with the dark, cloudy, rainy weather. I sought out a therapist, and right away he just wanted to put me on medication. I attended several sessions, and he would ask me the same questions each time. It seemed like he had a script of 5 questions and then prescribed medication. We eventually moved, and I missed an appointment, which resulted in a $250 charge. His wife, who managed the billing, sent me a text meant for internal use about my delinquent account. It said, "Make sure that this person pays. I complained to the doctor about his wife's comments and asked her to apologize before I made my final payment. She did not apologize. She simply said, "I'm sorry that you had to read that. Isn't that awful?" Story 17. When he started screaming at me, stood up and pounded on his desk because I sought advice from my primary doctor after he told me to. He then withheld my medication for a week as punishment. I got a new therapist as soon as possible. Story 18. Relatively tame when compared to other responses. However, he said the anxiety I have is due to new generations being weak and my apparent lack of exposure to nature. Story 19. When I told her I could not make that week session 48 hours, 24 hours, 12 hours, and 4 hours before the actual session start, I kept messaging, calling, and emailing to reschedule it because my health was deteriorating that week. Then she became upset when I did not join the call, asked me to pay for the session, and said that from now on, I must pay in advance for all of my sessions and accept that the money is lost whether I attend or not, emphasizing that I have to be serious about therapy. This is a therapist who has canceled sessions on me literally 10 minutes into the session while I was waiting in a video call. More than once. I gave up on therapy since then. I should probably try it again, but having had 6 very mediocre therapists and then a really bad experience really ruins the appeal. Story 20. I suffered a missed miscarriage and had to undergo a dilation and curettage procedure. I was distraught and very emotional, so the hospital assigned a therapist to assist me. I said that I was angry and couldn't stand to see the baby items I had bought at home. She told me without expression that I should not have bought any baby items yet and, in her opinion, you only buy things when the baby is born. She said I should give the items away and move on. She also told me that since I have another child, I should be grateful and focus on that. Story 21. I had to censor what I brought up to prevent her emotional reaction. She supposedly specialized in childhood post-traumatic stress disorder. Maybe there are some people who appreciate someone crying on their behalf. I can see how it might be validating, but I just felt bad for telling her things. Story 22. Their input was essentially, I do not know the answers to any of your questions. Why do not you try these pills? Story 23. When she told me she felt threatened, I said to her that I needed immediate help because of suicidal thoughts. Story 24. When she wanted to bring my family into every discussion, it felt like she wanted me to blame them for everything. Story 25. I missed the last therapy session because my mother became very ill and had to go to the hospital. In our next session, he asked me what had happened, and I told him everything in detail because it was traumatic. He just laughed and said, "Wow, you talk a lot, don't you?" Story 26. Told her how I felt, and she immediately wanted to put me on antidepressants and other medications. I only did one more visit and realized it wasn't for me anyway. Story 27. Told me that the traumas that happened to me as a child, teenager, and early 20s did not matter and would not affect me because they happened so long ago. The new therapist is much better, and I learned I have post-traumatic stress disorder from all that trauma. Who would have known? Story 28. When I had time to scroll Reddit and post this comment while waiting for her to join our session. She has been late many times. Story 29. This was my first and hopefully not last experience. I was telling her how I always thought of myself as being sad from the inside and that for as long as I could remember, I had felt an undertone of melancholy. There was nothing objectively wrong in my life with my family or from my childhood, which made me feel worse about feeling this way. She replied with a blank face, "Maybe that's just who you are as a person. Some people are jovial and happy, and some people are dull and sad." I don't know if it was the truth, but it made me feel like I should never again tell a therapist how I actually felt. Story 30. I came back from Afghanistan and the therapist was doing their checkups. She asked me one of the typical questions, such as, "Do you ever feel sad or on edge?" When I said yes, she just looked at me and said, "You're supposed to say no." Later, when I formally started therapy with her, she diagnosed me with a vitamin D deficiency without any blood work and said that was the root of all my problems. Story 31. When she had coronavirus disease 2019, she did not tell me and did not wear a mask when I went in for my appointment. Money is more important than keeping others safe and healthy, apparently. Story 32. One of my highest upvoted comments details my experience with group therapy. I'm fairly sure these are just counselors and not therapists, but the result of essentially being kicked out for being male and having feelings led me to not try to get another therapist for years. This delay led to a couple of thankfully unsuccessful attempts, many panic and anxiety attack-related hospitalizations, and a career change before I finally got back into therapy and found one that I work well with. Story 33. When he called me by his daughter's name and sternly told me I needed to get my life together, I felt awkward and did not go back. Story 34. When she explained things I had already told her as if they were completely original conclusions and then tried to help me through topics I was not struggling with. I do not think she ever listened to me carefully. Story 35. When she would not give me any advice except to find a sport or active activity and do it for at least 1 hour every day to manage my attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. I was a mother to a 3-year-old and 1-year-old during a global pandemic confined to my home. She was a part-time therapist who golfed with her wife every 3 days and did not understand why I would be interested in getting an official diagnosis and medication when I could just exercise. She also had diagnosed attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. Story 36. When she was helping me recover from an eating disorder and I said, I was really proud of myself today because I wasn't hungry but hadn't eaten a meal, and got myself to still eat a small meal to fuel my body, she said, skipping meals is okay if you are not hungry. Story 37. I didn't have the energy for the large amount of paperwork my therapy office next door required to get started, so I decided to try BetterHelp. I specifically noted depression as my reason for seeking therapy. 3 minutes into my conversation, she said, I don't really treat serious problems like major depression. I'm more of a life coach. No, thank you. Story 38. When I finally opened up and talked about my sexual assault, she told me she could not help me because it was not her specialty, and she fired me. It was the first time I really opened up about it. She worked exclusively with college-aged women dealing with trauma, which is exactly what I was. Story 39. When I said that my wife struggles with physical affection, the therapist immediately suggested that I should take hormone suppressants. I guess it is often the case that men complain about not having enough sex, but I was not saying that at all. She stopped kissing me as soon as we got married. She also struggles when she receives too many hugs from our 3-year-old daughter. Story 40. During COVID-19, I took advantage of telehealth therapy. I was paired with a very sweet older woman. One session, she spent 30 minutes talking about the drama going on between her and a friend. It was like hanging out with my grandmother. Great lady, poor therapist. Story 41. I was 22, going through a period of sudden, crippling anxiety, and she told me I better get my issues sorted before I turn 25 because otherwise I would be stuck like that forever. I am in my late 20s now and perfectly fine. When I told my new therapist about that, she was speechless. Story 42. To be honest, they kept repeating the absolute bare minimum basics that are shared with everyone entering the world of therapy and psychology as a practice. This is important for newcomers. That being said, I studied this field for 5 years. Additionally, I have been in therapy in some form my entire life, and they were made aware of this. Therefore, I made a personal rule that if a therapist is unwilling to adjust to my individual needs, they are not right for me. Story 43. Had a breakdown on the anniversary of my mentor's suicide. The Veterans Affairs therapist told me to have a pizza and get laid. Story 44. I went to a therapist in college who would tell 10 to 20-minute stories about herself and her family. They were only loosely related to what I was discussing, but her stories never conveyed any wisdom or lessons. She was just venting. It made a lot more sense why her sessions were so inexpensive. Story 45. When she said it was my fault my ex cheated on me and that she only hit me because I should have been better at understanding her needs. Story 46. When she canceled so many appointments that I missed my medication refill. Her office paid my inpatient bill so I could be monitored while going back on them. Story 47. When she scheduled my next appointment 2 months later after I told her I never felt as bad as I currently did and wanted to die, it made me reassess our decade together and realize she did much more harm than good. I have since begun the process of pursuing her license for medical abandonment. Story 48. When I, as a 16-year-old female, Told her I was bisexual but knew I could not tell my family. Her response was, "Do you see yourself ever settling down with a woman?" At 16, my answer was no, so she told me to just ignore that part of myself. Story 49. When she told me I would never have any friends if I did not loosen my boundaries. This was in reference to me cutting off a friend who associated with a rapist. Story 50. When he administered 4 intense eye movement desensitization and reprocessing sessions for trauma before completely stopping contact. He later emailed me months afterward asking for a Google review. Story 51. I went there during coronavirus disease because of severe depression. He said coronavirus disease was not real, glorified Germany's right-wing party. And when my boyfriend cheated on me, he said I needed to forgive him and have compassion for him because that poor boy really did not know where he was, despite me obviously being the one already struggling mentally. Story 52. He kept directing the conversation back to sex, no matter what. At first, I thought he was just trying to find out if I had been abused without asking directly. But he never stopped. After I told him I was a virgin, he kept asking when I planned to have sex and what kind of guys I liked. I tried to talk about my depression or anxiety, and he went right back to being creepy. I was a minor as well. Story 53. Ex-wife opened the session with a long list of reasons why I was at fault. The therapist said, "Yikes, why are you like that?" My jaw dropped, and I said, "Surely you'd want to verify if I thought those things were legitimate or even true." She was caught and became snippy for the rest of the session. At closing remarks, she said, "I feel like you didn't listen and were defensive. You probably won't come back. Please believe me, therapist. I saw through it all. And you will never see me again." On the way home, my wife told me they had already met and hid it from me. It was a total ambush. The therapist is now a realtor. Story 54. During our hour-long session, she screamed at and spanked her 3-year-old grandchild and went on an anti-transgender rant about Target. Story 55. When she tried to blame my suicidal thoughts, which occurred when I was 11, on my parents' divorce when I was 6, I did not get along with my dad and refused visitation. At that age, I was also molested by another student during a bathroom break. There was no mention of the bullying or real abuse I suffered at the hands of my peers. Story 56. I was on a 6-week course for anxiety conducted over Zoom. It was not really relevant to me, but I had been waiting a long time for any help at all, so I took what I could get. The therapist let the only man in the group rant about how women had treated him unfairly. When he was asked to let others speak, he huffed and tooted throughout. He was allowed to dominate for 2 sessions before he left abruptly. Story 57. When my therapist asked if I made up being sexually abused as a child, he argued I wouldn't be able to make jokes about it if it was true. It is often how I cope. He soon shut up when I brought the newspaper cuttings about it the following week. I never saw him again after that. I couldn't trust a therapist for years after that. Story 58. When we sat in silence for 45 minutes of my paid session, not because I was uncomfortable, but because I was lost on where to start. The second session resulted in 50 minutes of silence. I never went back. Story 59. I moved countries and found a new therapist to help with anxiety and obsessive-compulsive disorder tendencies. We reviewed my history of mental illness and discussed my recovery from my eating disorder, which I was managing fairly well. Each time I saw her, she would question me about my eating disorder, asking if I had bought a scale, if I was losing weight because I looked gaunt, and if I had been vomiting. I was not sleeping well due to anxiety. I relapsed after that. Story 60. When she texted me telling me she was fired from the company. Also, the company she worked for did not send me the bill until a year later. Story 61. When I was venting about family stress, she kept pushing me to just forgive everyone without addressing my feelings. She cut me off mid-sentence to lecture about positivity and once suggested I was overreacting to something serious. After a few sessions of feeling unheard, I stopped seeing her and found someone who actually listened. Story 62. I had 2 really bad experiences. The first person seriously asked me if I had ever considered just not being anxious before. The second was a couples therapist who discussed her own family problems in most sessions, including her brother and all her daughter's marital problems, with names and other information. She was also absolutely terrible at addressing my partner cheating on me. In the last session, she separated us to tell him that I must be poisoning him mentally, when it turned out he was still cheating on me and could not admit it to anyone. Story 63, maybe not bad, as I did like her up until this point, kind of. I have told her many times that I am not good at expressing needs or saying if things are not okay. After finishing a group program, she said, "So do you feel like you have enough tools to manage on your own now?" There is a bit more to it than that, but yes, pretty much. Story 64. He said the only animals that could count as emotional support animals were dogs because he had a dog and thought they were the best. Other animals did not count. Never went back to that person. Story 65. When I started talking about narcissism and the effect my family had on me, he looked at me and told me nobody is really a narcissist. That is just people's way of dealing with those they do not agree with, or words to that effect. I cannot remember it exactly as I was so shocked. I finished the session and did not return. Story 66. When she told me it was sad that I was not religious and that I would never recover if I did not become religious. Story 67. During my second session, he pulled up a Jordan Peterson video on YouTube and had me watch it with him. He blamed my problems on my wife. He then recommended a retreat where men share their feelings around a campfire in the woods, during which I would be pretend kidnapped to enhance the experience. At the time, I was in a serious crisis and did not have the strength to express how worthless and inappropriate his suggestions were. However, I am much better now, and now that I think about it, I should call and confront him. Story 68. When she started spending half the session talking about her life and family, I felt frustrated because I was paying for the service. Story 69. The one bad therapist I had was a couples therapist. My clearly abusive boyfriend insisted we go to counseling together because my personal therapist wasn't fixing me. At every appointment, my boyfriend would talk about how our relationship was failing solely because of me. He called me a liar and many other things, and I was made to apologize to him repeatedly and promised to try harder for him. The therapist never made him do the same for me. When I tried to tell my side, he said I was being manipulative and trying to bend the truth. She never once questioned him. She just perpetuated the abuse. Story 70. When I told her, my sister and I were coming out of the gas station and stopped to put our things in our bag, a man walked up to us, asked for money, and when we said we didn't have any, he kept asking and started getting aggressive. We were scared. She said, "Well, you two walked up to him, so it's your fault." I did not go back to her after that. I found a much better therapist. Story 71. And how does that make you feel? I am comfortable openly discussing my feelings, fears, and issues. I am a pretty open book, especially in therapy, where I am focused on solving issues within myself. My first therapist's response to almost any question was, "And how does that make you feel?" Honestly, I receive better therapy and advice from my dog. Story 72. Did not join a telehealth session for over an hour and still tried to charge me for the session. I disputed that very quickly. Story 73. Therapist 1 said that when she called me a bad person after I identified that I hold people I initially meet to an impossibly high standard, making it hard for me to make friends, and said she did not like that I did it. Therapist 2 refused to talk about ways to cope with or remediate my perfectionism and told me to buy a $65 book and read it. Therapist 3 said that I had horrible panic attacks while driving after a wreck, told me to just take deep breaths, and refused to see me more than monthly. Story 74. I was openly pondering why the human brain works the way it does as I was trying to navigate various mental health issues. She said she thinks it is all done by design, God's plan, because she is a Christian. I do not have an issue with a professional I am seeing having different beliefs than me, but to bring it up during our session on her own rubbed me the wrong way. Story 75. It was 2018. My mom had been in the intensive care unit, and as the doctor was walking me to her room, I got an overwhelming feeling that she was dead and everyone was lying to me. For a full day, I felt like it wasn't real. She wasn't real. I made an appointment to see a therapist. 2 months later, I met him. I wanted to talk about getting my severe anxiety treated and a gross feeling I had been experiencing where things didn't feel real. I didn't know it had a name. I saw him 4 times. The first visit went well. He just needed my history and didn't say much. The second visit, he criticized me about how I had anxiety. I told him about a scenario I often find myself in, which leads to magical thinking, a term I didn't know until he explained it. He was very informative with terms. I'll give him that. He said, "You're not God. Stop trying to control everything." Okay. The third visit, I cried. He was annoyed and asked why I was crying. I told him I wanted to know the cause of anxiety. For example, if I knew why, maybe I could get a better grip on treating it. He reacted strongly. "Do you think cancer patients ask why they have cancer?" "No, they just take the treatment that helps that cancer," he said. He promised to give me tools to help with mine. I was still crying a little, and he said, "Fine. Next appointment I'll set up my projector and show you why anxiety happens." He bragged about his credentials, and I agreed. I am not good at confrontation. At the next and final appointment, I showed up, but he did not set up the projector. He just asked me more questions about my life, and that was it. I called to transfer to a new therapist. At our first session, she asked something like, "What brought you here?" I said, "Matthew was unpleasant," and she smiled and said, "You're his third patient I've taken over." Before that, I thought I might have been too sensitive. Edit to add, at that third appointment, I asked if he even believed in anxiety. That's when he brought up his credentials. I asked again, "Do you believe in it?" He refused to answer. Story 76. Sat there and ate snacks while making small talk instead of, being a therapist. This was through a public health agency, and I wish that I could tell you there were qualified, skilled therapists, but that would be a lie. Story 77. About the fourth session in a row that he spent the first 10 minutes going over his notes to refresh his memory on who I am. Story 78. When he plugged in a Bluetooth speaker to play thrashcore while insisting I talk over it, called post-traumatic stress disorder nonsense, and talked about how much he hates his weekday clients. Story 79. When I had only spoken to her for 20 minutes, she told me to quit my job and move to another country. She then repeated the same thing in the next couple of sessions, as if that were the easiest thing in the world to do. Story 80. The very first session I had as an adult was for anticipated grief. My best friend had been diagnosed with terminal cancer. He told me, people could get hit by a bus anytime. Needless to say, I switched therapists. Story 81. When she told me she did not know how to help me because I was not religious, she said this was not a Christian practice or anything. Story 82. This is not that deep, but my current therapist told me that I have a lot of energy and might be a bit much for men when dating. When I told my friends about this, they were not cool with that comment and disagreed with her. Story 83. I had 2 therapists who basically became sounding boards for me and never actually helped me work through my issues constructively. I am now on my 3rd therapist in 6 years. Story 84. I was dealing with a lot of grief after my dad passed away, and I mentioned to my therapist at the time that I kept seeing shadows out of the corner of my eye and felt constantly watched and paranoid. She asked if I believed in the spiritual realm because she thought the shadows might be my dad coming back to visit me from beyond the grave. That definitely did not help with how I was feeling. Edit. Just to add a little context, my dad was abusive. Story 85. They would not listen to me when I explained how things made me feel. It was weird, almost made me doubt my own emotions. No, that event occurring upset me, and I am allowed to feel that way. It was not sadness. It was not confusion. I was angry. Story 86. I have had 3 different therapists. 2 of them told me something like, "It seems like you have it pretty well figured out," by the 2nd or 3rd session. The 3rd one had excellent reviews and was definitely charging a premium. You could only get a 45-minute session with her every other week. The appointments also had to be scheduled 3 to 4 months in advance. I stopped going because the sessions were not helping, and it felt like I was just wasting money paying someone with a more advanced degree to validate my feelings. Story 87. My ex-husband was avoidant, and I was a pusher. The best thing I could have done for my marriage was to let go and stop pushing. In order to save my marriage, I allowed him to stay at his female best friend's house every Friday night while I was pregnant. Yes, they were obviously having an affair and using crack, That was difficult to accept. Story 88. When she made me sign a contract with Christ and leave everything that was sinful, she did not even diagnose me. Story 89. When my parents put my siblings and me in family therapy during their messy divorce, my older sister constantly expressed how much she hated me. The therapist kept encouraging her to express her feelings, but I was not allowed to refute anything, defend myself, or speak up without being told to stop. We were 11 and 13 years old. Story 90. When he told my abusive father that I mentioned he was being abusive and suggested I did not know how to distinguish everyday negative interactions from actual abuse, he made my life very difficult. Story 91. When he said to me, after sharing some feelings I was struggling with, "Is there something you want out of that? I knew for a while he did not understand me or connect to me in any way. That was the moment I decided to find a new therapist. Story 92. The marriage counselor started favoring my husband and questioned me so much anytime I tried to talk about my issues with him that she literally stopped me between every 2 sentences to get more detailed information. She was infuriating. Story 93. The worst was when a family member was taken to the hospital. I informed my therapist over 24 hours in advance, but he then told me that I needed to pay him for the missed session. Needless to say, I ignored him since he was ineffective anyway. He would ask me to share how my thought process worked and then say, "I don't understand why you'd think that way. Shouldn't he help me change the way I think rather than just saying that?" I haven't been back to a therapist and don't plan on it, to be honest. Story 94. After I shared my concerns about my parents neglecting me in favor of my brother or other matters, he proceeded to cancel nearly every appointment we had in favor of other patients. His office was an hour from where I worked, and sometimes he canceled when I was already in the parking lot. The last time this happened, I went up and knocked on his door. There was no other patient, and he said, "I thought I canceled you today?" Story 95. They pushed medications and just told me to stop drinking like a parent would, without giving me any methods to cope. I ended up wanting to harm myself on the medications they had me on, and she was not much help otherwise. She did not really mention eating healthy or exercising, which is very important for many people when it comes to mental health and overcoming addiction. Medications can help people, but definitely not as a quick fix or first resort. Now I have a good therapist who actually helps me with the underlying problems that led to my bad habits. Story 96. When I told her about the progress I had been making after a period of extreme depression, her response was to say in a very nasty voice, "Well, what do you need me for?" Story 97. Literally paid more attention to a fly in the room than she did to me. We had struggled for 6 months by that point, and the only times she listened were when I brought my girlfriend with me. So, next session, after the "this fly is more interesting to me than my client" session, I bring my girlfriend in. Instantly, she was more attentive, actually helping out instead of ignoring whatever I talked about, and gave good advice. Then she emailed me, telling me to never bring my girlfriend again. I told her about the issues we were having. She suggested I try someone else in her practice. She was the head of her practice and had previously told me that everyone else there would have a difficult time with my case. She made it abundantly clear that she really only kept seeing me as a client for the money since I was paying out of pocket because my insurance did not cover it at the time. This also happened to be the last therapist I saw. The one immediately before her was amazing but moved to the city for higher pay, which was good for her, to be honest. I am still uncertain about seeing a therapist again, as it has been 1 out of 10 good to bad ratio, and like they've all told me, I am handling my problems pretty well. Why bother paying someone to make things worse when I'm apparently doing good enough on my own? Story 98. When she was willing to ignore professional ethics and be more of a friend than a therapist, she ended up giving me really bad advice because she could not be objective. I knew better, but I let it happen anyway because I liked her so much as a person. It was a huge mistake. I stuck with her because I felt like she understood me really well, but we should have stopped seeing each other professionally and just been friends. Story 99. Previous therapist was a Christian. I am an ex-Christian and had some emotional scars related to religion. She spent the entire session lecturing me about how God is good and that I need to return to God. I never went back to her or to God. Story 100. I have a sibling who uses they/them pronouns. I mentioned them a couple of times, and the therapist interrupted me and asked, brother or sister? I replied, they are non-binary and prefer they/them pronouns. She angrily half-shouted, was your sibling born a boy or a girl? I awkwardly told her, and we returned to the conversation, even though my sibling's birth gender was not relevant. She also immediately started using gendered pronouns to refer to them, which made the conversation confusing since I was using they/them, but she was using different pronouns while talking about the same person. That was my last visit with that therapist. In our very first session, she also tried to pressure me into medication despite me saying I didn't want to unless it seemed necessary. Story 101. When I was 20 years old, I was seeing a therapist. I had a boyfriend at the time who was unpleasant, so I kept talking about his behavior to my therapist, who suggested that I stop talking about him. I guess it bored her. I stopped seeing her after that. Story 102. When she missed 6 out of 12 appointments over 3 months, she did not acknowledge 2 of them. She apologized in advance for 3, once 20 minutes before the appointment start time. Another time, she sent me a message about having to skip, but it was intended for a different person at a different time with a different organization. She prided herself on her organizational skills because in her youth she was very disorganized. Fake it until you make it was her mantra. Story 103. After falling into a really bad depression as an undergraduate, not my first experience but the worst I had ever encountered, I got an appointment to see a therapist at the mental health clinic at my college. I told him about my depression, dropping all my classes the previous semester, thinking about suicide, and struggling to leave my dorm room. I described the worst couple of weeks when I only went out between 2 a.m. and 6 a.m. to avoid talking to anyone, eating from the vending machine because I was afraid that if I went to the late-night burrito truck or the 24-hour Burger King, I might see someone I knew, which was something I could not face. I told him that making an appointment and showing up, walking into the building that everyone knew housed the campus mental health services, was one of the hardest things I had ever done. But I had to, because I could tell I was not okay, and I feared it getting so bad again that I would have to drop another semester's worth of classes. He asked if I was currently able to attend class. I said yes. Then he went through what seemed to be a checklist on the clipboard he was holding. Had my parents abused me? Had I been sexually assaulted? Was I using illegal drugs? Was I currently, at that moment, considering suicide? After I answered no to those questions and a few others like them, he told me there was not really anything else to discuss, and I should come back if it got bad again. Story 104. When she started canceling a significant number of my sessions, and for the ones she did not cancel, all she would say the entire time was, yeah. Story 105. I have never been to one, but I had an ex who was seeing a therapist before we started dating. The therapist randomly encouraged her to avoid monogamy and suggested that polygamy was a healthy relationship style. She fully embraced this decision, and I ended the relationship there. I really liked that girl, so it was a pretty big emotional wound, but I definitely dodged a bullet on that one. Story 106. When she asked what I did to make my mother-in-law treat me poorly, I said I left early, when my husbands wanted to put him on medication during the first visit. Story 107. I went to therapy after my mom died. She was the glue of our family, and I was having a hard time with many things. I noticed an issue with my therapist when I talked about how, though I love my dad and brother, we didn't have the same connection. I mentioned that this could be partly because we are all different types of neurodivergent. I was trying to get help with not seeing them as a burden since they tend not to participate in facilitating family time. My mom definitely parentified me and constantly complained about what a burden they were. The therapist said, "They sound like dead weight. You need to cut them out of your life." Trust me, I had to cut out a lot of family, and I'm all the better for it. It also came up that my husband didn't drive. This isn't an issue for either of us and wasn't something I needed to discuss. It may have been related to scheduling an appointment or something benign, but she got very offended or angry on my behalf. She said, "That's unacceptable. He needs to drive, and you're enabling him by scheduling around him and taking him places. You need to grow a backbone, and I recommend a trial separation to get him to see how much you're doing for him and to show you what life might be like without a man baby." Absolutely irrational behavior. Story 108. During the second session, I had to repeat a very important point that took about 15 minutes. I realized she had simply not reviewed her notes. I sent her an email canceling all future sessions when I got home afterward. Story 109. I have met with 3 therapists in my life. One felt very judgmental and seemed incapable of understanding my experience. One was very nice and accepting, but we were so different that I did not connect with them. The third made me feel heard, listened to, and understood to the point that I was sobbing during our first meeting. These were my initial impressions of each therapist. From this experience, I have learned that I can easily trust my gut feelings. I am very blessed to have met the third therapist I mentioned. They were actually my academic advisor who had a previous career as a therapist and gave me what felt like free therapy sessions whenever I wanted. They saved me. Story 110. When she snapped at me for having a relapse, she said, "You are back to square one after all this time. I don't have to participate in this anymore." She only continued treating me to get into my billfold. Greedy. Story 111. Talking about herself. Talking over me. Refuses to discuss my medical issues. Arrives late. Changes appointments. Story 112. My therapist fell asleep in her chair mid-session. There is nothing like having someone fall asleep while you are talking about your problems. I did not have many more sessions with her after that. Story 113. She was not bad, per se, just not the right one for me. I knew because I did not feel comfortable sharing the things I needed to with her. Story 114. You check all the boxes for depression and anxiety, but you do not self-harm, so it is all good and just a coincidence. Then someone says your abstinence from sex and avoidance of it is because you were abused as a child but do not remember it. I was just a not horny 15-year-old who cared about gaming more than I cared about boys. Story 115. It was incredibly easy to get her to talk about her own life. I was heavily avoiding the topic, so I lightly tried to change the subject to something about her life. She took the bait and ran with it. By the time I moved on to another therapist, I knew way more about her than she knew about me. Story 116. When I went to the second appointment, he could not remember anything about me and could not understand his own notes. "So are you spending too much time playing video games?" No, what I said was my partner thought any length of time was too much time playing video games, and I was frustrated at having no time for my own hobbies. "Are you still feeling suicidal? Is that even my file?" Story 117. 2 things. She tried convincing me to stop consuming sugar and made it clear she would not continue our relationship if I did not comply. The other thing, she suggested that my non-binary identity was a result of trauma. I had already become suspicious of her over the sugar issue, but that was the final straw. Story 118. When she tried to involve me in a large billing and insurance scam, she sent me a massive bill for multiple treatments she had administered without informing me there would be additional costs. The amount was approximately $30,000. Then she told me she would waive the charges if I testified on her behalf against my insurance company. Story 119. Not for me, but my narcissistic mother-in-law was abusive toward my wife and her sister as children. In addition, my wife was raped at age 10, and my mother-in-law and her aunt protected the rapist. My mother-in-law manipulated the therapist into believing that she was innocent and the victim. My wife and her sisters all went no contact with her because of the well-documented abuse. The therapist contacted my wife and her sister and asked if they would consider family therapy, making it sound like the mother-in-law wanted family therapy and to apologize. They all agreed. 5 minutes into the so-called family meeting, the therapist told my wife and her sisters that there was elder abuse and that they needed to stop lying about their mother and making false allegations against her. All 3 got up and walked out. Story 120. She kept asking me about my pets. I understand wanting to build rapport, but it reached a point where I felt she didn't care about my depression. It seemed she only cared about my pets, ignoring that I was on the brink of canceling my subscription to Life. I like talking about my pets, but I don't pay $200 for a session to focus solely on them and not on me, the person paying $200 per session. Story 121. Straight away, The man was not interested in anything I had to say. He said I was already behaving the right way to improve because I stopped drinking and smoking marijuana. Story 122. My depression was not improving, and she started telling me to smile more often and that I had to want to be happy. Story 123. When I said I fainted because I was so scared of being paralyzed, it was a rough time for me and my anxiety. He said if it was God's plan for me to be paralyzed, then that was okay. I am very religious, but that did not help. Story 124. He was spending more time talking about what he was watching on television than trying to help with our marital issues. Story 125. I went to her because of many things, and one of them was that I got cheated on by my ex-boyfriend. Then I found out that my therapist was also cheating on her husband. Story 126. I know this is a thread for specific cases of bad therapists, but how common are bad therapists? And how did some of these therapists even have licenses? I'm only asking because I'm looking to get therapy when I can. Story 127. He would switch from topic to topic because he did not know what to talk about, followed by a couple of seconds of awkward silence. Story 128. When she said my postpartum depression was not real postpartum depression because I had a history of depression prior to pregnancy, I had been doing really well on medication before getting pregnant. Pregnancy hormones made me go downhill, and the postpartum period was a nightmare that ultimately ended in a hospital stay at 7 months postpartum. Story 129. When she agreed to see both me and my mother as clients and supported my mother during family sessions, my mother had undiagnosed borderline personality disorder, and her therapist was validating all of her choices and behaviors. Story 130. When she was 15 minutes late for our video call appointment and then immediately said, "Have you ever had to just poop really badly out of the blue even though you just went poop not that long ago?" When she joined the call, it was our third and final meeting. Story 131. Okay, I'm just going to say this outright. The mental health sector of Ireland is terrible. I went to child and adolescent mental health services, and on my first day, I was told that if I admitted to wanting to hurt myself or others, the police would be called on me. The clinician asked me a lot of questions and knew I was uncomfortable but continued without checking if I was okay. Then, to make matters worse, he asked if I was dating anyone at the time. I said yes. He then proceeded to tell my mother that piece of unnecessary information, potentially putting me in danger. Thankfully, my mother was accepting, but if she hadn't been, I don't know what could have happened. I stopped going to child and adolescent mental health services after they diagnosed me and then said my problems were too mild to be dealt with there. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.